Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sobel Co Nonprofit Quarterly Webinar. I'm Sally Glick, the Chief Growth Strategist here at Sobel, and I'm delighted that I'm joined today by Bernie Flynn, the CEO of Mercer Street. And I'm sorry, I said that wrong. I didn't finish it. Mercer Street Friends. We have a fascinating conversation for you today, and I'm going to encourage you to make this participatory. So if you have any questions as the conversation goes on, please feel free to use the Q&A area, pop your question in, and we'll try to get to those all before the conference calls, the webinar is finished. This is being recorded, and I hope that you enjoy it. Bernie has had a most amazing journey, moving from the corporate world to the nonprofit world. And he's going to share the experiences he's had in making that transition. So Bernie, why don't we sort of start with just a general overview and let our audience know the transition in the context of how you went from NJM to the Mercer Street Friends.
Yeah, thank you, Sally. I appreciate the opportunity of being here with you today, and I look forward to a great discussion. The context for where I am today, as far as Mercer Street Friends goes, and leaving the corporate community, really starts in college. I went to Fordham University, and I had a mentor, Father Leo Daly, who became a great friend, and he saw something in me and several of my colleagues at Fordham, and got us engaged in community service. We, as a group, formed the first Hunger Action Committee at Fordham. And, after I was deciding, what to do with the rest of my life, it turned out I went from an accounting major to a pre-law major, applied to law school, got in, and I was a little concerned about, what the future would hold, that I'd become a lawyer and practice law for the rest of my life and it'd be terribly boring. So Father Daly knew this, and he encouraged me to join the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, which I did right after college and before law school. So I deferred my enrollment in Rutgers Law School for a year. And I ended up down in Washington, D.C. as this Jesuit volunteer working in the school system there, based out of Gonzaga Prep on North Capitol Street. And we tutored young students, young people from the neighborhood, which was a pretty tough neighborhood in the Northeast in Washington, D.C. at that time. And we looked to give them a boost academically in math and reading. And then we had a robust summer program. And my second summer there, right before starting law school, I actually got to be the principal of the summer program. And it was a fascinating experience. 90 children, 6 teachers, several assistants. And, we just had a very good time with the children, made sure they had fun, but they were learning at the same time. And I almost didn't go to law school because of that good experience. And I told my soon-to-be wife, I said, I might want to stay down here in Washington, D.C. and get into education. And she said, well, how much will you get paid, if you're no longer a volunteer? And I said, $14,000 a year. And she looked at me and she kind of gulped and said, okay, honey, if that's what you want to do, I'll support you. Fortunately for us at the time, she was the real breadwinner in the family before we got married. But I determined, listen, I'm about to get married. I'd like to have a family. I realized that $14,000 a year is not going to cut it, particularly if I'm living in Washington, D.C. with my new bride. So I decided not to pursue education, and I went to law school, became a deputy attorney general right in Trenton with the New Jersey Attorney General's office, spent 6 years there. And then needed to make more money because there were no raises during the Governor Florio's administration. And I had been working in the insurance field for the Attorney General. So I jumped ship and went into the insurance industry and ended up at NJM Insurance Company, right in Trenton, born and bred in Trenton, New Jersey in the early 1900s. It's been around for more than 100 years. And I had a terrific 25-year career at NJM. But I never forgot about that educational experience that I had down in Washington, D.C. And also, at NJM, I just had the opportunity, kind of rising through the ranks, as a member of the law department first, and then in customer service with the personal lines division, and then in government affairs. They asked me to be CEO in 2008, and I was 47 years old. And it was overwhelming. But I asked for a lot of help along that way. I had a great team around me. We, as a team, succeeded over 10 years. But I felt that one of my primary responsibilities, and every CEO's responsibility, is to ensure the leadership after you leave. So succession planning became a primary responsibility and a goal and objective of mine, since I got started. The first piece of advice I got from a board member after I was given the job at NJM was don't screw it up. I mean, that NJM is an iconic New Jersey corporation. And the board member was essentially telling me, and I agreed, that I was a steward. I wasn't there to change everything. I was there to be a steward of the organization, to maintain all the good things that were going on at NJM at the time, and to improve things as I went along. But I also knew in my heart of hearts, and based on my experience up to that point, that leadership in certain positions has its time constraints. And I thought, my goal there was to be a good leader of NJM from 8 to 12 years. And that would be my imprint, that would be my time, and I needed to leave the organization ready for the future. And it just so happened, fortunately for me, that after 10 years, and it was the right time to move on, I was 57 years old. And I got to explore that desire, that passion that I had back after my college years, the experience I had in Washington, D.C. of education in an underserved urban environment. And I wanted to do what I could in the city of Trenton, because Trenton has adopted me as a corporate citizen. And now I'm a nonprofit citizen. And here I am at Mercer Street Friends, which is the lead agency for the community school model, working with the Trenton Public School System right now. And we are also the food bank for Mercer County. And we support our families and young mothers in the city of Trenton. So it's a full-fledged social service organization. I have volunteered my time here. I've been here more than 2 years now, but it has been quite a journey. But it's that experience that I had in college, and my mentor, Leo Daly, and what happened in the volunteer situation that I experienced, right after college and before law school, that really led me to this work right now.
It's interesting. Often a path is more linear, and your path has been completely circular. You had your humble beginnings, turned yourself around, and now at this point in your life, you're right back where you wanted to be, where you had almost started. It's an amazing transition, but I am certain in that circle, a great deal of experiences and learning situations have come up. The transition between being a CEO in the corporate world and being the CEO of a significant nonprofit, I'm thinking are both the same and at the same time very different. And I wonder if you wouldn't share what everyone's probably wondering, how did he even do that? So going in that, making that smooth, seamless, if it would be, transition, and also even talking a bit about some of those skill sets. How did it transfer over? You spent the first, up until the age of 57, doing something one way with skill sets that accomplished that. And now you're in an entirely different place. So how have you made that happen?
Yeah, well, there wasn't anything smooth or seamless about it, Sally.
It sounds good though, right?
I thought it was going to be smooth and seamless, but it wasn't. Of course, things were aggravated for me because of the pandemic. I started as the CEO of Mercer Street Friends in February of 2020. And so 4 to 6 weeks in, the pandemic had started, shutting things down. We certainly had a taste for what was going to happen before then, but everything starts to shut down. And here I am in a completely new environment. And I will say, I was just spoiled. I was spoiled by the corporate environment. I was spoiled by the resources that are available there. I didn't have any business startup experience. I was always part of a larger, well-resourced organization, whether it was the New Jersey Attorney General's office or NJM Insurance Company. It was a shock. And I have to be honest, I was overwhelmed. And I went back to, what I knew I had to do when I first started as CEO of NJM. I asked for help. I admitted I didn't know. I talked to people. I listened. You have to learn, a completely new sector of our economy when you make that switch from the corporate world to the nonprofit space. It wasn't easy, but what kept me going was the people, here at Mercer Street Friends, the mission, that we had, and the necessity of conditions during the pandemic where we had to soldier on. And for us, we were absolutely essential during the pandemic as the food bank for Mercer County. So I used my network, relied on friends, organizations, and the good people here to kind of move through that difficult, period. And then things started to settle. But it was, in terms of skill sets, it was very similar, how starting at a corporation as the CEO and starting at a nonprofit. But I will tell you, nonprofit leadership is absolutely harder. It requires a broader skill set. Corporate leadership, and again, I'm not including small business here because I view small business as very similar to nonprofit work. But corporate leadership, you can plug your gaps. You can go after the resources that are necessary to make the organization successful. And you just don't have that to the same degree in the nonprofit space. So it was quite a learning experience. Good thing I love to learn, and I wanted the challenge, but it was more than I bargained for.
I'm sure it was. So when you talk about that difference and the fact that in a corporate environment, a commercial environment, you have people, perhaps financial support, accessibility to a variety of things. And I've heard you say always through the years, both for-profit and nonprofit, most specifically the for-profit, is the importance of the team, the importance of the culture. And you said earlier how you built a team around you that enabled you at 47 to get the help you needed and to get to the role you needed to play and bring the skill set so you didn't mess up NJM, right? So how did you fill that gap if you don't have the resources or the plentiful resources? What do you do instead?
Well, in the nonprofit space, you don't have a choice. You end up doing it yourself. And that's where being overwhelmed and the anxiety and the trauma comes in. Now, you have to have a plan for making it better for yourself as a leader, making it better for your organization, making it better for those you serve. But it's a continuum. And when I started here at Mercer Street Friends a year earlier, there had been layoffs in key positions to save on costs. And so there were some real gaps that had to be filled. I will tell you immediately what we did was, we concentrated on making sure we had the funds to run the organization. Ironically, the pandemic helped in that regard because the philanthropic community and government came in to help. We got a Paycheck Protection Program loan. We had foundations who were just asking us what we needed. So from a financial standpoint, we had the opportunity to fill some of those gaps. But I used consultants, Sally, to plug those gaps immediately. Fortunately, my prior network and understanding the landscape in the state of New Jersey, some terrific people, who were either already here helping Mercer Street Friends, and we enhanced, the amount of time they were giving us, or we brought people in, and then certainly anticipating that we would, in time, fill those positions, those areas of responsibility, with full-time staff and leaders. But we weren't in a position to do that right away in the beginning of the pandemic.
Well, there's no question we've all evolved as well with COVID, right? What looked in March 2020 as certain things that were going to be, happening for a few weeks ended up, here we are 2.5 years later, still lingering with some of that uncertainty, and you're still dealing with that. But I know I've heard you talk about the important advantages. The disadvantages become clearer. You were humbled by the experience and the shock almost of, wait, I have to do this myself. But you also had tremendous advantages, a career that brought you back from where you'd been, many years earlier in your pre-law school days. So what are some of those advantages? People on this call are in the nonprofit world, they're leaders, they want to motivate and inspire, and they are facing the same challenges you are, even if they didn't start in the corporate world. What's that hook?
Well, the hook in my view with regard to the nonprofit space is like what I experienced when I was a college graduate. And you see, you're out there in the community, whether it's feeding those who are hungry, sheltering the homeless, working in the education environment where students don't have the same opportunities that children in the suburbs have, because zip code does matter. It's tremendously fulfilling. So the mission of the nonprofit community, whatever that mission may be, is the hook. And I think that's well recognized. It can't be the be all and end all, in my view. But it is a tremendous advantage. I have counseled several folks since I retired about how to transition into the nonprofit space. And typically it's people who have already had substantial careers in government, in education, or in the corporate world, and don't need as much compensation as they used to. But they need some in order to make ends meet comfortably. And I think, currently, pay equity is one of those big challenges in the nonprofit space that needs to be addressed. And that's something we're working on, very hard, here at Mercer Street for the sustainability of the organization. But the quality of the team, the people that you work with in a nonprofit setting, is really, it's wonderful. You're all rowing in the same direction. You all want to help, given you the specifics of the mission. And if you're not interested in that, you're simply not there. Now, I come from a corporate environment whereby I considered the service at NJM to be the closest thing to public service in a private corporation that you can get. An organization focused on service to policyholders, that's recognized nationally for its customer service, that pays back dividends, when there's enough money, to be paid out for claims. NJM is known for that. So it was an easy transition when you consider that NJM environment I was coming from, that was very community oriented and service focused. But the nonprofit community, has that clear advantage of the service orientation, wanting to help improve our community, and help individuals thrive and prosper.
So the mission of that nonprofit is the great unifier. And you've come to this organization and whether it's feeding families or any of the other amazing things that mental health issues, abused families that have driven people to the nonprofit community. But what you've been able to do in this not seamless and not smooth, but certainly successful transition is take those lessons, take those characteristics that you honed as a young man going into from 47 on being a CEO of a major organization, and then saying, guess what? It's what it sounds like to me. This works in a nonprofit environment also. There can be discipline. There can be strategy. There can be flexibility. Those are not just characteristics owned by the for-profit corporate world. We can do this here. So what skill sets, what did you need to capture from your CEO hat wearing days at NJM and say, I'm going to bring those kinds of traits here. How do I make that happen?
Yeah.
What did you have to do?
Well, for me, it was really transferring that experience, that you just described, and the skills that come with that experience, and bringing it into an organization so that the frontline workers could be freed to pursue the mission. We didn't have human resource experts here. We didn't have IT experts. We didn't have project managers. We didn't have strategists here at Mercer Street Friends. There was some experience, but it wasn't brought together the way it can and should be for medium to large nonprofits. So I was able to fill those gaps so the rest of the team could meet the mission. And that's what I view as essential to leadership in the nonprofit space. There are always going to be gaps. So you're playing whack-a-mole, to a certain extent. The leaders need to fill those gaps to the greatest extent practicable themselves by getting help, consultants, bringing in, other leaders to free folks up, to execute on the mission. But I think all those things that come from a wide-ranging business/corporate experience, are typically needed in the nonprofit space. I was at a Chamber of Commerce luncheon, before this webinar today, and talking about with someone who was interested in transitioning to the nonprofit space. She's a consultant, talked about maybe starting her own nonprofit. And I said, well, that sounds terrific. I encourage you. But look at some of the nonprofits that you already work with that are out there that need help, that are already pursuing a mission that you're interested in. They may need you to come in and help them fill gaps that their board of directors doesn't even recognize at the moment. So there are so many opportunities available, to those who are interested. And thank goodness for that, that the nonprofit space is wide ranging. Just in the Mercer County area alone, we have hundreds of nonprofits. It's one reason why I didn't want to start a nonprofit. I wanted to help, a nonprofit that was already functioning that may have needed that boost. And I think that's what happened here at Mercer Street Friends.
We're talking a lot about leaders and leadership. Tell me a little bit about some of those characteristics. People say great leaders are good listeners. Great leaders are great coaches. Tell us a little bit about what you've experienced in that regard.
Well, I think good leaders have to check their ego at the door, particularly in starting out, making that first impression. It's so important to respect the individuals and the organization that you're working with or for. It's common practice, but maybe not always done so well, that a new leader has a listening tour. says he or she won't take any real action until, 3 months of finding out about an organization. I think that's critically important. If you aren't appropriately deferential and respectful to those who you're going to rely upon to meet the mission, you're going to lose them early on. An example of one time I was in a government building, and a new commissioner had just been appointed by the new governor. And this commissioner was speaking to all the employees of that particular agency. And this person just spouted off all the things that this person was going to do. Didn't mention the staff and how the staff would be supported, how they together would meet the mission of that particular governmental agency. And I was with a friend, and I turned to that friend and I said, so-and-so, he just missed a great opportunity to engage the new staff. And it was a lesson to me because, that's not how you go in. And then once you get there, you've got to be genuine, authentic, transparent. And once you tell folks that's how you're going to be, you've got to prove it so that you can gain trust and credibility. And then you can be off and running if you've shown that you're a collaborator, a facilitator, a listener. You will gain support, and that will enable you to get things done. And I would also say change is constant, but change, I don't believe in the Big Bang theory when it comes to organizations. You don't come in and blow it up. I've never been in a situation where I felt that the workforce needed to be transformed, or that it was a turnaround insolvent organization. And in the insurance space, I had seen as a lawyer for the insurance industry, I had seen those types of situations in the insurance sector. So you want to hold on to your people. You want to gain their trust, and the way to do that is, in my view, is being authentic, communicating. You can't communicate enough, and you ultimately have to create a culture where there is accountability. So over time, the handful that might not be up for the mission or just collecting a paycheck, they can't undermine, the morale and the culture of your organization. And you have to deal with that in a very sensitive, respectful, but firm manner. And you will win some of those folks over, and you will lose some of those folks.
And I'm assuming that conversation that you just had applies not only to staff, but to the board of directors as well. You've got those two audiences, and you're then balancing on that fine line between the two.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Sally.
No, I was just saying, so would you talk about that just a bit? I'm sure there are people on this call that do that balancing, juggling act every day.
Yeah. It's quite a juggling act. And you mentioned, the board and staff, and it's critical for a CEO or any executive leader in corporate America or in the nonprofit space to gain the trust of the board. So when it comes to transparency and listening, the same rules and guidance applies in my view. And the board, we have to all remember here, and I've experienced this, very clearly. A CEO a CEO has bosses, and those bosses are the board members, whether in the corporate or nonprofit space. So all of a sudden, when you're the CEO of an organization or executive director of an organization, you could have 8 to 12 to 24 bosses. Now, granted, your chair and certain other leaders on the board, are going to take more of an active role in supervision, so to speak. But those, board members are people too. You have to treat them with respect. You have to listen, and more often than not, there's a lot to learn from those who are on the board who have committed to the mission. But it's a very important relationship. And so, what we're talking about here, Sally, are relationships when it gets down to its core. Relationships with the people you work with every day, relationships with those who are on the board who you meet and work with every month, let's say, and your community that you serve. Those relationships need to be um, protected. They need to be respected, and they need to be invested in.
What I'm listening to you and hearing over and over, which I'm hoping everyone else is making copious notes, is that the conversations that take place in the corporate world at the end of it all, including about being a great leader, including about building meaningful, respectful relationships, including building trust and transparency by being genuine, all of those are the very same things that are held dear in the nonprofit side. We have this for-profit, nonprofit conversation. Well, I'm a for-profit. We are fond of saying here at Sobel, it's your tax status, not your business plan. It's not your culture. It's a totally different entity, but it's at the end of it all, no different, as you've indicated already, than a small business with all of the needs and all the care and feeding that goes into any kind of a small business. And like a small business, there's often a succession. You've already had a succession from one role into another of your own personal movement. There's a question in the Q&A area saying, what is your succession plan? Are you looking for someone from the commercial sector to join you in the nonprofit space, or is there someone from within the organization at Mercer Street Friends who might be, or is that the way you'd be going? You mind sharing a little bit? I think everyone's sort of saying, how you got here. What happens with all this great leadership when you make that change? What will happen then?
Well, I love the succession planning, questions and discussing it because I think succession planning is too often put to the side when it comes to upper level executive discussions and board level discussions. So one thing that I did early on, because succession planning is so important, the future of Mercer Street Friends for me is a tremendous responsibility and is so important that we brought in a consultant to help us with emergency CEO succession planning. So we went through a board level process where we determined what would be the advice that I would give if I was no longer available to the organization we use the phrase hit by a bus. So if I get hit by the bus, what would the board do? Who would they look to? Who would step in to lead Mercer Street Friends in the short term, as well as what does that process look like for determining the long-term leader? And so our board has just this past spring approved an emergency CEO succession plan. Obviously, who is identified in that succession plan can be a very sensitive topic because we've got a lot of people involved in this process, and determining, who's number one and who's number two to succeed me on an interim basis is sensitive. But it's more typical to have a process whereby I'm still around and I'm helping with a traditional succession plan. And let's say I give our board of trustees 2 years notice that I'll want to really retire, this time. And so it's time to, bring in or go through the process. From a succession planning standpoint, I prefer to have both internal candidates who are on a panel. You'd love to have, 2 to 3 internal candidates. And then obviously you can go outside and look at the external candidates. I have, from everything I read and all the observations I've made, and I pay attention to succession planning within the insurance industry as well as the nonprofit space, it is much better if an internal leader succeeds, the prior leader. And, that it could be that, that internal leader might have been hired 2 years before the departure of the outgoing CEO. But it is typically better for the organization to have an internal candidate. But rest assured that our board of trustees at Mercer Street is becoming, more and more engaged in the succession planning. And it's not just succession planning for the CEO. It's succession planning for other key positions in the organization, chief financial officer, chief operating officer, chief development and marketing officer, for instance. But it's also critical to have good succession planning for the chair role and the role of chair for other committees, not just the board. These have to be topics of conversation at most of your meetings. So that's what I would encourage. And for those of you who are now serving on nonprofit boards, if you haven't heard anything about succession planning for the day-to-day leader, that's a huge priority. And then next, you want to know, what's the succession planning look like for the leader of the board? Because the leader of the board is the one who is going to have the most work to do if the CEO or executive director of an organization is moving on into retirement or to another job. So it is a full-on fiduciary obligation, of the board to steward all of that. The challenges ahead for Mercer Street Friends. I'd really like to talk about that with this, this good group of people, because it's a passion of mine. I've already mentioned the pay equity issue,
right,
in the nonprofit space, and unfortunately, we have it at Mercer Street Friends. My firm belief is that the nonprofit sector is every bit the government sector and the corporate sector, in terms of capability, in terms of, skill. The nonprofit sector, in my view, is kind of too deferential and does not step forward, maybe pounding the fist on the table figuratively, and say, what we do is important to our community. It is important to our economy, and the skills and experience that we bring to our jobs need to be recognized with a rewards package that is comparable to our government workers, our educators, and the corporate space. Now, I'm not saying that CEOs of nonprofits should be making, 7 figures. What I am saying is that it is a travesty if I've got a family caseworker who is pursuing a graduate degree as a social worker, and that person is making less than $40,000 a year. It is a travesty. And we have examples where we are performing work that is required by the state, to help support, certain families in need. And yet the funding that we see, the government funding that is coming in, does not support the kind of salaries for our caseworkers who are boots on the ground, making a difference in our communities. It just doesn't support them. I have full-time caseworkers who are making $35,000 a year. Now, we have addressed that in this intermediate term by paying bonuses periodically. But we need government appropriations that respect what is being done and that pay, what is an appropriate wage. So pay equity is something that I will continue to talk about. I don't think we in the nonprofit community need to apologize for it. We need to get up to market levels And we need to honor our folks and respect our folks with what are, living professional, wages and benefits. Fortunately, Mercer Street Friends has a strong benefits program that has been maintained for some time. But that wage, I shudder every time I look at, our data, and there are not enough funds coming in, from our particular grantors, government grantors, to pay our folks more on a regular basis. So we do what we can with bonuses and such, but this is a continuing issue. The other thing, well, go ahead, Sally, you ready?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. So thank you, Colleen, for suggesting I call in through a different device. I have no idea. I was just sitting here and suddenly you couldn't hear me. Vicky also was nice enough to say we can't hear you. In terms of not only your succession plan and the succession plan, one of the questions that we've talked about, you and I, is the whole evolution of the nonprofit community. And yes, pay equity is one key, but I want to make sure that we get in your whole full vision on that and that institutional knowledge that you bring to this situation.
Yeah, well, I think, the kind of professional development that we're used to in the corporate space and in government and education is another area of focus in the nonprofit, space. Now we need funding for that, right? And unfortunately, too many nonprofits are scraping by and don't necessarily know, where their sustainable funding is going to come from. So what happens as a result? Things like professional development for our staff aren't as available as they would be otherwise. And retention of employees is going to be a very significant issue, in my view, for nonprofits in the foreseeable future. As we have, a job market, jobs are available. They're out there. And we don't have all the skilled folks to fill those jobs. So who's last, on that list to get their jobs filled? Typically the nonprofit community. So these are the risks that I see, intermediate and longer term, that need to be addressed in part with the help of government.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to provide these services and the nonprofit community is going to be an arm of government, well, we need to see the same level of resources in our nonprofit organizations as we see in our government agencies. So I wanted to make that point. I hope everybody can be an advocate for that because it's a real concern of mine going forward.
And, Bernie, you have made this transition, but others may follow your lead. Both those listening carefully here, as well as anyone around the world who says, wait, I'd like to do something else with the second half of my journey. Whether they're influenced early on as you were, or they just suddenly become engaged in philanthropic activities later in their careers. So do you have advice for them? And maybe that onslaught of retired corporate leaders will also impact and change the demands of the nonprofit community, because you're going to have some impressive leaders who are saying, wait, this isn't good enough.
Well, I hope that we have, more leaders in education, government, but certainly corporate, who look to the nonprofit space as an opportunity to be engaged. But I'll tell you my quick story that will kind of reflect my journey to Mercer Street Friends in the near term. After retiring in April of 2018, I had a good couple months off. My wife was happy. I cleaned the garage, read some books that I, hadn't been able to get to. But I enrolled in a class, an early childhood education class at the College of New Jersey. And it required me to be an assistant teacher in the Trenton school system. And I was an assistant teacher for second grade at it's no longer Woodrow Wilson Elementary School. The name was just changed. So here I was that first fall after retirement, and I was tutoring small groups, helping the teacher out as best I can. I did some lessons, and what I learned was that while I was thinking about maybe, teaching young kids because of my previous experience there, teaching second graders is too hard. And I didn't have the patience or the skill set to do that. And then I started consulting with different nonprofits, and I realized that my highest and best use was becoming an executive in a nonprofit. I decided I wasn't going to start my own, but that I would help out, somewhere else and make that commitment. And that was the best decision for me after that tough experience of realizing teaching second graders is just too darn hard. Maybe I could have tried, teaching history to teenagers, but I couldn't keep up with the second graders, and teaching is, just a wonderful profession, but it was part of my journey. And I would encourage folks to pursue their highest and best use in their next chapter. But that highest and best use, in the first phase might be going out and reading to preschoolers or packing food bags at your local food bank. And then after that, once you learn more about certain organizations, maybe it's doing more. Maybe it's joining a board of a nonprofit. Maybe it's actually, doing part-time work for a nonprofit in an executive capacity, filling a gap. There's such talent out there. And you know what? I didn't love golf well enough, to want to golf every day. So I would prefer working at Mercer Street Friends. I found the right place for me. I think it's everyone's individual journey to find the right set of circumstances, the right experience for them. But please engage in the community.
It's sometimes a challenge to be self-aware enough to know what the highest and best use of your time is, and to be a little humble about that if it is reading to second graders or packing a grocery bag, and at the same time looking forward and knowing that you can use those experiences down the road and continue to do more. You've been we entitled this Leadership for All Time because it wasn't just the fact that, although it was an important component in who you are, that you were an amazing CEO and led an organization and were able to create and contribute. You didn't screw it up, and you contributed to it being an iconic organization. And then with the second half of your journey to say, what else can I do? I can consult, I can volunteer, and I can lead. And I understand the difference between and the sameness between the for-profit and nonprofit world. So we have all been very lucky that you have been a leader for all time and across all different sectors. But I'm curious if you have, we have about 10 minutes. I don't have access to the Q&A anymore. Colleen, are there any other questions? Because I can't get to them from my phone.
No, we don't have any questions right now.
Okay, thank you.
Jeffrey has his hand up, so if he wants to put a question in the Q&A, he can.
Thank you. And then if you'll share with us, that would be great, because I just have a little limited here. But if there was someone coming, I'm sorry.
No, I said okay.
Okay. I just didn't want to talk over you. If someone came to you, Bernie, and said, I need your advice. I do need help. I don't have all the answers, but I'd like to make this jump. Is there something that you might kind of, in a nutshell, encapsulating all that you've shared with us in the last hour, that you would say, no matter what, remember these three things, or remember this one thing? Is there something you can help us with?
Well, part of my advice would be do something. Get up, get out of the house, do something. Of course, in the pandemic circumstances, you can get on Zoom. There are courses. There are courses out there related to nonprofit, leadership. There are tremendous volunteer opportunities that run the gamut from, packing those food bags to tutoring in our schools, reading to our students, helping with a fundraising event. But I think, the quality of the experience of the people on this call would lead many to think about, how can I help at the board level? So to me, It's really leaning forward. It's accessing people like myself, but there are many others out there. Learn about organizations. I had to learn about Mercer Street Friends to determine whether Mercer Street Friends might be the right place for me. And my hook with Mercer Street Friends was the community school model. And I wanted to be involved in the Trenton education system. So that was my hook. Find your hook. Find what you're most interested in.
Do you mind for a moment, in case anyone on here doesn't know what that community school model means? Would you? I should have asked you that right early on. Would you share that?
Yeah, and that's how I see, some of the future challenges of Mercer Street Friends. The community school model is one whereby additional resources are brought in to, for the most part, struggling school districts, where you are trying your level best through these additional resources to remove barriers to learning, and then come in and better boost and support academic success. So we are involved in providing mental health supports for our students, making sure they are vaccinated with all the vaccines that they need, not just COVID related. Oral health, we have terrific dental programs, primarily Kinder Smiles in the city of Trenton, that is doing tremendous work with our students. So you have eyeglasses so they can read the board. So you have all those practical physical and mental health supports that are provided. There are opportunities to engage the parents in activities as well as social service supports. We make sure that the students have tutoring and mentoring opportunities available to them. We provide summer program. Our children, learning loss is significant as a result of this pandemic. A lot of that data and research is coming out right now. We just finished 6-week summer programs for close to 200 students in the city of Trenton. So they've been given an academic boost over those 6 weeks, where we bring in teachers for morning instruction, and then they do enrichment activities in the afternoon. They go on trips on Fridays. They have a lot of fun. We will continue to do that, but the community school strategy and model is something that the Biden administration is fully behind. We're pursuing grants from the federal government so that we can expand our community school involvement from 3 schools that we're in right now to more. The Boys and Girls Club is our partner in this endeavor. They're going to be, they're in right now, 2 schools. So we have in total 5 community schools in the city of Trenton. Eventually, we're going to need the state of New Jersey to step up and recognize that additional resources need to be brought to bear in our underserved urban centers, where, our governor, who he likes to say, and he's correct, that our public school system in the state of New Jersey is either number 1 or number 2 in the country. And according to the data, on average, he's right. But how can we have the best public school system in the country and still have some schools in the city of Trenton or in Newark or in Atlantic City or Camden that are among the worst performing schools in terms of academic proficiency in the country? And that's the situation in Trenton. It's not because we have bad teachers. We have great teachers. I know the teachers. We have great principals. There are different issues that come to bear because of low income, poverty conditions. The children and the families need more supports. That's what we provide. And we need to make it a district-wide effort. And that funding ultimately needs to come from the state of New Jersey to support stronger education for our children in these underserved areas. That's what Mercer Street Friends does. And that's what, I look forward to being a part of for quite a few years to come.
Thank you. I just wasn't sure that everyone actually was familiar with that terminology. Colleen, are there any questions?
No, Sally, there are not.
Great. Thank you. I apologize for the fact that I don't know what happened to my technology. I'm usually pretty careful to keep my hands off of all the buttons and just disappeared. So I'm sorry that I interrupted the flow of the conversation, but I can say I'm quite sure for myself, Sobelco, and all of the people, we have an amazing group of people on this call today, on this webinar, and it's because, Bernie, of the willingness and the good sharing that you've been willing to do for us, to tell about this experience and to encourage, hopefully, others to follow in those footsteps. And when you have the wherewithal and you don't necessarily have major economic constraints, and you've done many things on the corporate part of your lifetime, if you can transition over, whether it's smooth and seamless or more challenging, it certainly seems to me, listening to you, Bernie, that it's worth it. The fulfillment and the ability to create change and have such a positive impact is what true leaders are about. And so that is what you've represented in any role you've had, is that true leadership. And we thank you for sharing and being transparent and touching on the stuff that wasn't as easy as well. It's great to go up there and say everything's fine. Oh my God,
No. I don't mind being humbled. It's happened quite a bit in my career.
Well, it's refreshing, and it's also fair, right? So I want to know all of the possibilities when I make that move, but it's also good to know that at the end of the day, it's so worthwhile. And we thank you for that. If you check our website, everyone, there are other events coming up. We're glad to have you. And I'm so sorry again that my technology or something I touched on inadvertently created a problem. Everyone always wishes I talked less. Well, there I was, not talking at all. It just was at the wrong time. So, thank you so much, Bernie. It's been a pleasure having a conversation with you and sharing it with all of our nonprofit and for-profit friends.
Well, thank you, Sally, and I appreciate everybody's participation. And Sally, I've known you for a long time. You do great work, and it's a privilege to be on a webinar with you.
And we feel the exact same way. Thank you.